This is the Biblical Unitarian Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, the podcast that aims to start conversations about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. My name is Dustin Smith, and as always, I will be your host. This week we have episode 342 entitled Avoiding the False Dichotomy Fallacy. We're continuing to work through the various logical fallacies in order that we can better understand them. We can recognize when we mistakenly use them. We can call them out when others are using them against us. And the entire point is that we can begin to make much more persuasive arguments in dialogues so that we can convey our theology much more effectively to others. In order to do so, we have to avoid falling prey to logical fallacies. So this week's episode will examine the false dichotomy fallacy. It's also known as the black or white fallacy because it appears when someone says that it must be either black or white, but there are actually more options that exist, and the person that is giving you the choice that it either has to be this or that is either unaware of the fact that there are other options, or they are hiding those options from you. Thereby, they are giving you a false dichotomy. This particular logical fallacy simplifies issues that are naturally complex, and they force a choice between two extremes, and they ignore other possible alternatives or perspectives that are more nuanced. And this happens all the time in common culture, and unfortunately it also happens in theological debates about God and Christ. So, what are some of the common ways that the false dichotomy fallacy is committed in 2024? How can we identify when we or others accidentally use this fallacy? Why is this fallacy unhelpful in our debates about God and Jesus Christ? And how should we dialogue and discuss theology without falling prey to the fallacy of the false dichotomy? Let's find out on this week's episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast. Our first point today is defining the false dichotomy fallacy. If you've been around for a while, you know that's the first thing that I do, is that I like to define my terms. I want to make sure that we are all on the same page before we move forward and we develop our argument. So, the false dichotomy fallacy, which is also known as the black or white fallacy, is when someone oversimplifies a complex issue by presenting only two options or potential outcomes, and in doing so, they ignore other possible alternatives, either knowingly or ignorantly. Now, how often does this happen in our common culture? Well, we're in debate season, so it certainly happens when people are talking about the political climate. So someone might say that if you don't support this particular policy, let's just pick one out of a hat, if you don't support this policy on the border crisis, then you must be against progress. But this argument falsely assumes that by supporting this fallacy, it is the only way to be in favor of progress. It ignores the possibility that there are other ways to support progress or to give legitimate reasons as to why you should oppose the policy. So it gives a false dichotomy of two perspectives when there are actually other possibilities that are available. What about when people decide how they're going to parent their children? So someone might say that either you let your kid do whatever the kid wants, or you have to be a strict authoritarian. And those seem like two extremes. This is a false dichotomy. The statement ignores a middle ground that most parents tend to arrive at on their own, which is a balanced form of parenting where one can actually set some boundaries without being overly strict or overly permissive. So they find a third option in the middle. What about when it comes to the environment? Someone might make the claim that either we completely ban all plastic products, including all plastic straws, or you just simply don't care about the environment at all. And this is a clear example of the logical fallacy that we are discussing. The argument overlooks the possibility of simply reducing plastic use, or incorporating recycling, or finding some alternative materials instead of this sort of all or nothing approach. What about personal choices that one might make? So someone might say that either you're going to succeed in this career or you are a complete failure. Either you succeed or you are a complete failure. And this statement, on top of the fact that it's just unloving, it presents success and failure as the only outcomes. It disregards the possibility that this could just be a learning experience, or considering the option that you could have a partial success, or that you might actually decide to change your career path and build on top of the skills that you have already learned in this particular career. It's not a matter of succeeding or being a complete failure. There are many middle ground options. How about this one? This might be cutting a little too close to home, but people that have a narrow theology. So raise your hand if you have heard this one in the last 6 months. Someone says to you that either you agree with me on this particular interpretation of this one passage, or you are a false teacher who leads others astray, and that you are an example of an apostate. How many of you have heard something like that? Either you agree with me on how to interpret this one passage, or you are a false Christian that is on your way to hell, and you're taking others with you. So obviously this is arrogant, it's prideful, it's unloving, it's judgmental, and it assumes that either this person is right or you're just a false teacher. And, it's really assuming far too much over one particular person's ability to interpret something correctly. Heaven forbid that we are mistaken or wrong on some things that we actually learn and develop in our own lifetime. So we've looked at some examples. Why is the false dichotomy or black and white fallacy fallacious? What's actually wrong with using these arguments? Well, it of course gives you a false choice. It creates this artificial either-or situation where there are probably multiple options that are available to you. Perhaps there are combinations of options, or a middle ground that is just simply not being stated. It wrongly forces a choice between two options that are extremes, and it will often exclude more reasonable or nuanced positions. It also ignores complexity. Many of the real-world issues that I listed already are multifaceted and complex. By simply reducing them to one of two possibilities, the fallacy ignores the intricacies and the interconnections of a particular situation, and it leads to an incomplete understanding of the topic at hand. Now, often people will use the false dichotomy way of arguing in order to be manipulative. They will use it to manipulate behavior or to get people to think in a particular way. And it pushes someone into making a decision by making them feel that only one of the presented options is acceptable. Like when I said earlier that either you agree with my particular interpretation or you're a terrible Christian who is leading people to hell. Obviously, that is just not true. So people will use this tactic in order to manipulate and control people, usually because their ability to persuade people is extremely poor. It is an unfair way to have loving, respectful, and charitable conversations. It also discourages critical thinking. By presenting only two options, this particular fallacy discourages any deeper analysis or critical thinking on the topic. It limits the exploration of other possibilities or solutions by stifling open discussion. It leads to a narrow viewpoint. Often, the false dichotomy fallacy will lead to polarization. It polarizes discussions by framing the issues as this sort of us versus them. And by that, we mean either you're right or you're wrong. And of course, we are on the right side. So if you don't agree with us, then obviously you are wrong. This is unnecessary. It creates conflict and division, and it doesn't allow for a more balanced or compromised-based solution to be explored. So enough about the hypothetical examples. People are interested in how this gets used in Christological debates. So let's transition and move to point number 2, common false dichotomy fallacies in debates surrounding Christology. So I'm going to talk about some of these, and I'm going to explain why they fall prey to this particular fallacy. So someone might say, and this gets said all the time, especially on the internet, because I get them in the comment section of my videos all the time, you either believe in the Trinity or you're not a real Christian. That is a textbook example of a false dichotomy. It presents the belief in the Trinity as the only way to be considered a Christian, ignoring the fact that there were no Trinitarians for the first 350 years. Jesus wasn't a Trinitarian. None of his apostles were Trinitarians. Paul wasn't a Trinitarian. There are no Trinitarians in the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, and in the first half of the 4th century. Many people today who don't believe in the Trinity claim to be Christians, and they are in alignment with the belief systems of the early church. So that is, of course, a false dichotomy. Someone might nuance the conversation and say, well, if you don't believe in the Trinity, then you are denying the importance of Jesus. Because in reality, when it comes to talking about the Trinity, I tend to find that people are more interested in the sort of things that you say about Christ. No one denies that the Father is fully God. There's no argument there. That's not the issue. It's always coming down to who Jesus is. But by saying that if you don't believe the Trinity, then you're just denying Jesus, this argument presents obviously a false dichotomy by suggesting that if you reject this particular doctrine of the Trinity, then you're denying Jesus himself. It overlooks other theological interpretations or possibilities that accept the importance of Jesus without adhering to the doctrine of the Trinity. Again, see every single Christian for the first 350 years of church history. How about this particular argument? All early Christians believed in the Trinity, while those who refused to were universally regarded by the church, capital C church, as heretics. Unfortunately, this is just an irresponsible summary of history. There were no Trinitarians in the first 350 years of the church. In the 2nd century, it had Unitarians, sometimes called dynamic monarchians. It also had Logos theologians, that is, Christians who believed that the Logos was a second God. They actually believed in two gods. They had the true God, which was the Father alone, and then the Logos was a second lesser God. And all of these Christians were subordinationist. They didn't believe that the Father was co-equal with the Son. And then when you get into the 3rd century, in the 200s, then you actually start to have modalists. You start to have Sabellians that start to say that the Father is the Son, and the Son is the Spirit, and the Spirit is the Father. And you have all of these options that are on the table long before anyone even knew anything about what the doctrine of the Trinity was. How about this one? Let's just kind of shift it a little bit to Jesus being God. So the false dichotomy is commonly said that either you believe that Jesus is God or you are denying his importance entirely. This is a textbook example of the false dichotomy. You're either suggesting that you recognize the importance of Jesus in a way that requires the belief in his full divinity, but in doing so, you are ignoring other potential viewpoints that were believed by Christians, both ancient and modern, namely that Jesus was the human Messiah. And it's possible to believe that Jesus was the human Messiah without fully equating him with being God. Now, some people, their belief that Jesus is divine is just another way of talking about the Christian faith, or what they think the main purpose of the Bible actually is. So an argument might be made that if you don't think that Jesus is God, then the entire Bible is false. The only thing that's false about this is its dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy. The statement implies that by denying the divinity of Jesus, you are undermining the entire Christian faith, and you are throwing out all of Scripture. This, of course, ignores the possibility that you could view Jesus as a central figure of the Christian faith, as the Son of God, as God's anointed King of the kingdom, as the Messianic Son of David, which makes Jesus a human being, a man, a member of the human race. You can say all these things. It doesn't mean that you accept that Jesus is fully divine. Or how about this one? Unitarians get this one alike. They are often told that if you don't believe that Jesus is God, then you're just saying that Jesus is just a mere man. Either Jesus is God, or you're just saying he's a mere man. And this argument, of course, ignores the possibility that someone could believe in Jesus as the human Messiah, the Son of David. Or as 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 5 clearly says, Jesus is the man Messiah, Jesus. And the verse before that, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 4, says that God wants all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. What is that truth? Well, at least includes the fact that Jesus is the human Messiah. Now, the next example is not going to be a false dichotomy. It's going to be what I call a false trichotomy, because it's going to give three options, but in reality, there is a fourth option that's available to you. And this is the famous false trichotomy from C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, which was published in the 1950s. And C.S. Lewis said that Jesus was either a liar, a lunatic, or he was God. And see, this is where they try to manipulate you, because you certainly don't want to say that Jesus was a liar. You certainly don't want to suggest that Jesus was a lunatic. Well, what's the only other option that he gave you? Well, Jesus must be God. Okay, but again, this is just a false trichotomy. You're given three options when the biblical data points to the fact that Jesus was making messianic claims. He wasn't claiming to be Yahweh. He wasn't claiming to be the only true God. Jesus distinguished himself from the only true God. In fact, he called the Father the only true God. He never said, I am God. He never said, I am Yahweh. He never claimed to be the only true God. He claimed to be the Son of God, the Messiah, the Son of David, the King of God's kingdom. So this famous false trichotomy continues to get used today, but it is very clearly fallacious in its argumentation. So why should you abandon these particular arguments immediately, and why should you call out others when they use these arguments? Well, clearly they are oversimplifying the data. They reduce complex theological discussions into these overly simplistic choices, and they ignore the diversity of Christian thought and interpretation, both ancient and modern. They also clearly exclude alternatives. By presenting only two options, or in the case of C.S. Lewis, presenting three options, your argument is going to exclude other valid, logical, reasonable theological perspectives that existed in historical Christianity and still exist today. And the main issue here that I think is going on, and I could be wrong on this, but in my experience, there is this pressure to conform. There's this manipulative attempt to control people in order to get them to conform. These statements can be manipulative by attempting to pressure people to conform to a specific doctrine under the implication that failing to do so will result in the loss of salvation of their soul. They will no longer be considered a Christian. We're going to call you a heretic. We're going to label you as an apostate, and we're going to kick you out of our denomination. And many people want to remain a part of something bigger than themselves. And so they give up their ability to think logically, and they start to believe and say things that are logically incoherent. So how can we keep ourselves from falling prey to the false dichotomy? This is our third and final point, how to avoid committing false dichotomies. Here we go. Ready? Number one, we need to acknowledge complexity. We need to recognize that many theological issues are in fact complex and they require nuanced conversations. Before forming a conclusion or a particular interpretation, let's make sure that we are taking the time to explore all of the possible options, perspectives, and outcomes. This is why it's important to listen to people that believe differently from us. It's important to read other scholars. It's important to have other people tell us what they think, even if they have a different perspective than what we have. Number two, we need to consider multiple perspectives. You should take the time to actively, deliberately, and intentionally seek out other viewpoints, other interpretations, even if you know you're going to initially disagree with them. This helps you to be informed in a manner that allows you to see the full range of possibilities, and thereby you will avoid oversimplifying the issue. Number three, we want to be able to ask open-ended questions. So when you are discussing a topic, make sure you ask open-ended questions that encourage the exploration of different solutions and different angles. This can help you to uncover options or avenues of research that might not be immediately apparent. So it's good to ask those open-ended questions. Next would be to be wary of extreme positions. Watch out for and be very, very careful of those who make arguments that present positions that are extremes. And they offer these extremes as the only choices. Either you accept this or you take this other extreme. Consider whether there is, in fact, a middle ground, or if the situation might actually be more complex than it's being portrayed. Next, reflect on the issue before responding. Take a deep breath, slow down, and take a moment to reflect on whether you are actually being presented with a false dichotomy. If you're feeling pressured or manipulated into choosing between two extremes, question whether the person who's talking to you is being fair to you and whether there might be some more valid options. Also, we should avoid generalization. Be very cautious about generalizing too broadly from specific examples. Just because something applies in one situation or in the interpretation of one particular passage doesn't mean that that's the way that you interpret it universally. That's an overgeneralization. It ignores something that needs to be more nuanced and is actually more complex. And there are several things in the Bible that actually are fairly complex, and we tend to generalize them because we want to make them easy, and in doing so, we distort their true picture. And the last piece of advice would be to encourage dialogue. Foster an environment where different views and interpretations and approaches can be explored and presented respectfully. This is going to reduce the likelihood that you're going to fall prey into this sort of one way or the other, us versus them, black or white thinking, and it opens the door for hearing potential solutions that might be considered creative, or at least something that you've never considered before. So by following these examples, you too can avoid falling prey to the false dichotomy fallacy. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Join us next week as we look at yet another common logical fallacy. Next week, we will look at the burden of proof fallacy. I am looking forward to discussing that with you. I hope that you please look forward to our next episode. If you enjoyed the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, please consider supporting us as we aim to promote the sound truths about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. You can support us absolutely for free by subscribing online, by giving us an honest review online, and by sharing your favorite episodes with your friends. If you feel led to offer a donation, please check out the episode description for a PayPal link. The Biblical Unitarian Podcast is produced and edited by Dustin Williams. I am Dustin Smith, your host. Until next time, please take care.